Hello, welcome to another episode of our Africa First Pan-Africanism Podcast. Again, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Charles Penn. I'm Dr. Penn. I am a Cameroonian born African currently residing in the United States. And over the past couple of weeks, I have tried to put my own perspective into what is going on around the world from a geopolitical standpoint, mainly things affecting Africa in the 21st century. A lot has been happening. A few weeks ago, we did cover the situation that was going on between the Democratic Republic of Congo and Rwanda and the Rwandan-backed M23 militia that has been terrorizing people in the Democratic Republic of Congo, committing acts of committing war crimes in the Democratic Republic of Congo, as well as also killing a lot of people, killing and raping a lot of women, including children, in the Democratic Republic of Congo. So we did touch on that. We touched on the peace deal that was brokered back in June or July between the Democratic Republic of Congo and the government of Rwanda. And we talked about the fact that this peace deal did not include the Rwandan-backed M23 militia that also continued to kill people in the Democratic Republic of Congo even after the peace deal was signed. And we were going to follow up on what was going on at that time because there had been a proposed agreement that would potentially be reached between the government of the Democratic Republic of Congo and the Rwandan-backed M23, and this was supposed to be brokered by Qatar. And we had said we would keep an eye on that. Now, in the past week and a half, a lot has been going on. I am going to focus this episode on what is going on between Russia and the Republic of Ukraine, because that has been going on since 2022. And this is essentially a proxy war between the United States and Russia, or between the United States and NATO on one side and Russia on the other side. And they're just using Ukraine as a proxy to fight this war. From my point of view, I do think that this is a continuation of the Cold War that really never ended. After the Second World War ended, there was initially the Allied forces, Great Britain at the time, the United States, and Russia that helped bring down Germany, that was advancing its nationalist and fascist regime at the time. There was a brief period of hope after the Second World War ended, when Roosevelt had been trying to promote a state in the world where people will have self-determinism and political liberty throughout the world. I mean, there was a proposition, and the creation of the United Nations and NATO at the time was to foster democracy around the world and self-determination of peoples around the world. And there was a period of hope after the Second World War ended, but then Franklin Roosevelt died, and after Roosevelt died and Truman took over, this hope was very quickly extinguished. And, it ushered us into a period of the Cold War that went on from the mid-1940s all the way to 1991, when the Soviet Union eventually collapsed. And this was a war of ideology. This was a war between, on one side, democracy and the spread of a capitalistic form of democracy in the West as a counterbalance to the socialist governments that came out of the East, mainly the Soviet Union and China. And, this went on for a while. There was never really any confrontation between these two world superpowers during this time. There was escalations of conflicts in different regions of the world and threat of nuclear war in different regions of the world. But it was really an ideological conflict. And, it eventually ended with the Soviet Union collapsed. But since then, you would think that the Cold War ended after the Soviet Union collapsed, but the ideology of the West has still been propagated and is what is mirrored in this war in Ukraine. Ukraine as a nation for 100 years or so now has been plagued with conflict. And, they have switched sides. They initially allied themselves with Germany for a while. They were part of the Soviet Union during most of the Cold War. And when the Soviet Union did eventually collapse, Ukraine gained independence. But after Ukraine gained independence, there were nationalist movements that started in Ukraine. And there's something that we do have to understand about this war currently in Ukraine, because the West would want you to believe, that what is currently going on in Ukraine is Putin's way of expanding his empire and creating his old Soviet Union. To a certain extent, Putin has been an aggressor in Ukraine, but the West does not tell you the full story. After the Soviet Union collapsed, Russia has been pretty adamant that it does not want any aggression from NATO going to the east. It does not want NATO in its backyard. And with the nationalist movements in Ukraine, the West has used that as an opportunity to help themselves expand NATO and surround Russia as much as they possibly can. So this has been an aggression from the West as much as it has been an aggression from Russia. This is the same thing that happened in 2013, 2014 with the revolution in Ukraine that eventually led to the ousting of then Viktor Yanukovych, who was the Russian-backed president of Ukraine at the time. He was ousted in 2014, which very rapidly led to Crimea voting to join Russia. And Russia was able to annex the territory of Crimea at that time. Then there was cessation of conflict for a period of time until 2022, when, again, Ukraine still continued to insist on joining NATO. NATO had been organizing and carrying out military activity in Ukraine, installing military posts in Ukraine as a direct provocation of Putin in Russia, who has repeatedly said he does not want any NATO activity in his backyard. The U.S. and the West has this double standard. An example of this would be the situation that happened in Cuba in the 1980s with the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? Because the U.S. acts like, oh, Russia is the aggressor all the time. But if the situation was reversed and Russia was putting troops around the borders of the United States will for sure respond with force. And that's an example that almost led us into nuclear war, with Russia installing missiles in Cuba in the 1980s during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And Cuba is farther away from the borders of the United States than Ukraine. Ukraine really shares borders with directly shares borders with Russia. So, this is why I say this is a continuation of the Cold War, because it's still a fight of ideologies between the West and its capitalist form of democracy and the ideology of socialism and communism from the Russian Federation. And they have been butting heads since the end of the Second World War, and that has really never ended. Even though over the past multiple decades, Russia has maintained its steadfastness in the fact that this is what I want. We do not want NATO in our doorstep. We are not going to be the aggressors. If you just follow this, this key recommendations that we've given, if you just follow the bare minimum criteria that we have set, we do not want any form of aggression, because any form of aggression is going to be met with force. And that is what happened in Ukraine. And Ukrainians have been dying. About 1 million Ukrainians have died since this conflict started in 2022. And again, as I said, the West would want you to believe this is just an aggression from the side of Putin, because he wants to expand and reestablish the Soviet empire that collapsed in the 1990s. There's been no indication. I mean, there was a speech given by Putin in June where he had given the history of the territory and talked about how Ukraine was initially part of the Russia at large, and usually the West will cite that speech as the example or as evidence of the fact that Russia or Putin, vis-a-vis this conflict, is trying to expand his borders and create the communist borders that existed before the fall of the Soviet Union. So, the reason why I wanted to talk about this conflict today is because over the past week and a half, there have been a series of meetings, first between Donald Trump, the President of the United States, and the President of Russia, Putin, on August 15th, where they tried to come to some sort of an agreement, because people have been dying and continue to die in Ukraine. And so, Donald Trump was able to meet with Putin. After that meeting, there was a joint press conference in which they kind of kept the language very vague, talking about, we were able to reach some agreements. We were able to agree on a couple of points, and some points we did not agree on, but they did not really say any specifics on what these agreements were. And shortly after that meeting was then the meeting between Trump and major European powers, including President Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, where, they still talked about, the fact that potential peace deal will be reached, and that this meetings, they were trying to get to the point of some sort of peace between Russia and Ukraine, and the issue that has been going on with Ukraine. So I'm going to play a brief snippet of that meeting that actually took place in Washington between Donald Trump and some European leaders. The reason why I want to play this is because even though they praised Donald Trump for at least getting to the point of creating an open dialogue with President Putin, if you listen to the language of European leaders, you can draw the conclusion that these are just talks and they're not really going to lead anywhere. I'm going to play that video, and then we will kind of talk about it. Initially, like the brief bit that I do want to play of this video is, when Donald Trump did give the current German chancellor, the chance to talk, and basically set some basic minimums that need to be met by Russia for further talks to go on. And these basic minimums are things that Russia is never going to agree to. So let's listen to what Chancellor Merz had to say in that meeting.
Thank you very much, Isla. Mr. Chancellor from Germany, a very great leader.
Mr. President, dear Donald, many thanks for having us today. I think this is extremely helpful that we are meeting and hearing that the two of you are having such a good meeting today here in Washington. The next steps ahead are the more complicated ones now. The path is open. You opened it last Friday. But now the way is open for complicated negotiations. And to be honest, we all would like to see a ceasefire, the latest from the next meeting on. I can't imagine that the next meeting would take place without a ceasefire. So let's work on that, and let's try to put pressure on Russia, because the credibility of these efforts we are undertaking today are depending on at least a ceasefire from the beginning of the serious negotiations from next step on. So I would like to emphasize this aspect and would like to see a ceasefire from the next meeting, which should be a trilateral meeting wherever it takes place.
Well, we're going to let the president go over and talk to the president, and we'll see how that works out. And if we can do that, I will say, and again, I say it, in the 6 wars that I've settled, I haven't had a ceasefire. We just got into negotiations, and one of the wars was, as you know, in the Congo was 31 years long. Another one that we settled last week with 2 great countries was 35 years going on, and we had no ceasefire. So if we can do the ceasefire, great. And if we don't do a ceasefire, because many other points were given to us, many points were given to us, great points. Please, Georgia, go ahead.
So that was what Chancellor Merz had to say about the topic going forward. He insisted, and he started by saying, the fact that Donald Trump has been able to bring Putin to the table and open dialogues, that was the easy part. And he insisted that there has to be a ceasefire. At the beginning of this meeting, Donald Trump had explicitly said that, he hopes the ceasefire happens. At this point, it is not going to happen. And if you look at the position that Putin is in, the ceasefire is not something that's going to happen. I mean, he is advancing. He has captured major territory in the eastern part of Ukraine. There is no incentive for him to now slow down and have a ceasefire. Trump talked about, we've had brokered peace agreements where we just went in and brokered a peace agreement and there was no ceasefire. And the reason I actually played this snippet was, one, because it reinforced the fact that European leaders act like, we do want peace, we do want an end to the hostilities, but this proxy war that has been going on in Ukraine is more so a war between NATO and Russia, and between NATO and the United States on one side and Russia, because essentially NATO buys weapons from the United States, and then it uses these weapons to give to Ukraine, where Ukraine then uses these weapons to fight Russia, because NATO really just wants to fight Russia. The European Union just really wants to fight Russia. They have explicitly come out and say they expect to be in an open war with Russia in the next 3 to 5 years. This is what the European Union has said, which baffles me, because they keep saying that, and it's very important that they engage in a war with Russia, and for the time being, they have been using proxy powers to conduct these wars, and the claim that it's because, Russia is an aggressor and Russia is trying to expand its territory throughout all of Europe. But there's been no evidence since the end of the Cold War or since the collapse of the then Soviet Union that Russia actually intends to do this. And I don't think that European powers even believe that Russia wants to do this. Because if they truly believe that, they would be developing their military. They're not developing their military. Like the military of most EU member countries put together is not even up to the military of Russia. So if you really believe that Russia was at your gates and was intending to attack your countries, I think that the preparation will be more than this. So that leads you to believe that this is a front for an aggression of ideology against communism, which I don't know why these people feel that they need to continue the Cold War that has killed a lot of people in different countries for this fight over ideology and the spread of ideology. Why would you not just let people decide for themselves? The fact that you believe in capitalistic democracy does not mean you have to force that down the throat of another person. Europe does this thing where they create the impression that this is what Russia is doing, and they spread that propaganda in the media so that it then confirms it legitimizes the war of attrition and the war of aggression towards Russia. And they label Putin the devil and the person that just is aggressive and wants to fight all of these wars so that, their ideology would not be questioned when they then go in and do these things. It would be something that I would be able to stomach, particularly personally, if they were fighting these wars themselves. The problem is they have dragged poor countries, namely Ukraine in this scenario, into this war of attrition. And it is not European citizens, it's not the citizens of France, it's not the citizens of the United Kingdom, it's not the citizens of Italy, it's not the citizens of Germany that are dying in this war. It is the citizens of Ukraine. And you would argue, based on what Zelensky says, that the Ukrainian people actually do want this war to continue, and you would be wrong, because the recent Gallup polls in Ukraine have shown that an overwhelming majority of Ukrainians actually do want some sort of cessation or ending of this war. But then you have this diplomatic sit-downs that happen, and leaders who claim that they all want peace and who claim that they all want cessation of hostilities, but they still set terms that would never be respected by Russia or would never be respected by any country that is in the position that Russia is in today. Some of the other terms that they did set at that meeting were they wanted some security guarantees for Ukraine, some Article 5 type security guarantees for Ukraine, whatever that means. The language of these talks has deliberately been very vague so that, nobody would be able to understand when the war continues, because the war is going to continue. The war is not going to end, because Europe does not want the war to end. Trump might want the war to end, and he campaigned on the fact that he wants these wars to end and he wants to end these wars, which was the next thing that I was going to jump into. If you do remember when I played the clip, Donald Trump claimed to have ended 6 wars in his second term as president of the United States. Like, what are the 6 wars that he claims to have ended, and he ended some of them without any ceasefire deal, and they were just peace deals that were signed. One of those wars he did mention was the genocide that has been going on in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and it still continues to go on in the Democratic Republic of Congo. We mentioned this genocide a couple of weeks ago when we talked about the peace deal that was brokered in Washington between the foreign minister of the DRC and the foreign minister of Rwanda. And this happened in Washington a month and a half ago. And at that time, when we had covered that, I did mention the fact that this peace deal was never ever going to hold, because this was a peace deal between the Democratic Republic of Congo and Rwanda. It did not mention the main militia, M23, that has been capturing territory in the eastern part of the Democratic Republic of Congo, including the North and South Kivu regions and the Goma region. And we had talked about the fact talks were going to continue to happen between the Democratic Republic of Congo and M23, which, a lot of people were not happy about, including myself. I was not happy about that because, there is this precedent that has been set of militias picking up arms, killing people, committing war crimes, committing genocide, and then sitting down and having diplomatic talks. They commit this act with impunity. And it sets a precedent that other militias can then see and say, oh, okay, we can do the same thing. We can pick up arms, kill people, commit genocide, and sit down and be recognized by the international community. But anyways, I was holding out hope for the fact that maybe something was actually going to come of that. I did not agree on the fact that we should have been acknowledging M23, the militia M23, by giving them this microphone, this megaphone, so they can legitimize themselves by holding these peace talks. Well, this was going to be brokered by Qatar, and the initial declaration of principle was signed on August 8th. And the goal had been to eventually lead to cessation of hostilities, the withdrawal of M23 from the Democratic Republic of Congo. But this just happened. This was supposed to happen this last Tuesday. But then on Sunday, M23 did go out on X and said their representatives were not going to be in Doha at all, and they were not going to be participating in these peace talks. And you have Donald Trump saying he's helped broker this end to this war in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Meanwhile, just last week, the UN did confirm that M23 was responsible for the death of over 300 people in the Democratic Republic of Congo, including children. A civilian casualty that they said was the worst since this war broke out in 2023. So this is a report on Al Jazeera that basically lays out how these peace talks are breaking down. They're not happening. M23 is pulling out because it claims the initial declaration of principle included the fact that the Democratic Republic of Congo was supposed to release prisoners of war. Now, the Democratic Republic of Congo claims this was not a part of this initial declaration. They were claiming this was going to be part of the final negotiation, August 18th. That did not happen because M23 ended up pulling out of this. And the fight still continues. M23 continues to kill people in the Democratic Republic of Congo while Trump sits down and claims that this war is something that he has helped end. He can go tout himself as the ending, the bringer of peace and the broker of deals. But the truth of the matter is the hostilities continue to happen, and Congolese people still continue to die until this day. The war has not ended. We are not going to forget what is going on in the Democratic Republic of Congo just because Trump says that he ended a war. We are not going to forget. 300 people died last week, and M23 needs to be held to account. And if we do have international organizations like the African Union and the United Nations and the United Nations Security Council, the International Court of Justice, and nobody is able to hold this militia to account, then we do have international systems or international organizations that continue to fail us every day, while the people that did set these organizations claim they are these benevolent providers to the universe, and they are these benevolent bringers of peace to the universe. And I had talked about this when the initial peace deal happened between Rwanda and the Democratic Republic of Congo. And I had said these are wars that are started by colonialists, and then they come in there and try to act like we are brokering peace, but they've just created conditions for hostilities so that they can come in and exploit natural resources. The United States got out with the deals that it got out with from the Democratic Republic of Congo, but as we just mentioned, the hostilities are still going on. People are still dying in the Democratic Republic of Congo until today. In a couple of the other wars that Donald Trump claims that he has ended in his second term as president, there was the war between the short period of violence between India and Pakistan over the region of Kashmir, that, the West or the United States did kind of push both countries to come to a ceasefire and stop hostilities, even though the United States was not officially credited for ending that war. At least India does not recognize that the United States helped end that war. And then there is the war between Israel. This is another important one, and it illustrates this fact of wars of attrition that are started by the West or started by the United States, and then they would come in and create this idea of, we are negotiating peace, when everything was actually started with their help, right? And I am referring to the 12-day war that went on between Israel and Iran. And for a long time, during Netanyahu's reign as prime minister of Israel, he has been beckering the United States and trying to convince the United States since 2005 or so to get into a war with Iran. And the United States public, or United States public opinion, has generally always been that a war with Iran is not in the best interest of the United States. Now, when Donald Trump campaigned to be president, he campaigned as this war ender and this peace bringer, and the person that was going to end all of the wars. He was going to end the war in Ukraine in 24 hours. He was going to end the genocide that Israel was committing in Palestine. He's not end any of those. He's still struggling to end the war in Ukraine. He did do what no president before him for a while has done, which was really sit down, open dialogue with Putin and actually try to have negotiations, even though, the EU is just convincing him and dragging him back into this war. And with the conditions that they have put on him, there's no possibility that these terms are ever going to be agreed upon by Russia. And it's between Israel and Iran. And this is a war that Israel eventually dragged the United States into. This 12-day war happened in July. It was between July 12th and July 24th, where Israel initially bombed various nuclear sites in Iran, and it claimed to be protecting itself, but this was not really the reason why Israel bombed Iran. because that Netanyahu has been claiming that Iran is developing nuclear weapons and Iran is trying to develop nuclear weapons, but there is no evidence. He's brought forth no evidence that Iran is actually developing nuclear weapons. Now, Iran is enriching uranium, but it has since insisted that it's doing so for civilian use. And if they were actually developing nuclear weapons, and in the U.S. through former President Barack Obama had actually reached a treaty with Iran, if you remember, the JCPOA was an agreement through tariffs that the U.S. put on Iran, and they had come to this agreement that Iran was going to allow NATO forces in the United States to conduct regular checks at its nuclear sites to make sure that it was not advancing towards developing nuclear weapons. But then, during Donald Trump's first term, if you remember, with the push from Israel, he backed out of that agreement, because what Israel has always wanted was to overthrow the government of Iran. Israel has always wanted to overthrow the government of Iran, and that's why they eventually attacked Iranian nuclear sites on July 12, 2025, which led to multiple days of escalations because Iran retaliated by attacking Tel Aviv, dropping missiles on Tel Aviv. This led to escalations that then eventually pulled the United States into this war, even though public opinion in the United States was that this was not in the best interest of the United States. But eventually, what did Trump finally do? He dropped missiles. He dropped bunker busters on 3 major nuclear sites in Iran. That then led to Iran retaliating, even though this was just kind of a public show of, okay, we are going to do something back and we are going to retaliate, which is what they did by bombing the airbase in Qatar, the U.S. airbase in Qatar. That did not lead to any U.S. fatalities. But eventually, on August 24th, on July 24th, Trump was finally able to get the two sides, Netanyahu and the president of Iran, to agree to a ceasefire and stop all of these hostilities. But who started this? This was Israel, backed by the United States. So you can't pat yourself on the back for stopping a war that you started. This is a war that Iran wanted no part of, but they were forced to be a part of. And then you start a war, and then you pat yourself in the back for stopping it. And this has been U.S. foreign policy, and it's been the foreign policy of the European countries since the Cold War, which is why I said the Cold War really never ended. And if you see the hostilities that are going on in various places around the world now, it's just a continuation of the Cold War. It's just a continuation of this ideology, the battle of ideologies, one from the West and one from the East. And it's still going on. We are in a never-ending Cold War, and the price stacking up, and it's getting higher and higher, and we don't understand that human life is valuable. You cannot sacrifice human life for your political gain. And that is what the European Union does not seem to understand. That is what the United States does not understand, because 1 million plus Ukrainian citizens have died since this war between Russia and the European Union started. And these are Ukrainian citizens. These are people that are never going to get their lives back. These are families that are never going to, their lives are going to be changed forever. People have been displaced. Their futures have been destroyed. And this using of people as political pawns of an ideological game is ludicrous, and it's preposterous, and it's abhorrent that you powers would continue to do this in the 21st century when there's so many other things that we can be doing. There's so many other discoveries that we can be having and advancing ourselves as humanity, as a civilization. And we are continuing to fight these wars of attrition that are never going to end and never going to go anywhere. I don't think the European Union thinks that it can win this war with Russia, but it continues to fight it. Like, where is this going to end? When is this going to end? There's no use of this. And the sooner we understand that there is no use of this, the better. I am going to end this episode today by talking about, again, because I mentioned that the strategy of the U.S. and of the West has always been to overthrow foreign powers, and it's been to destroy other countries in the attempt to enrich itself. I'm going to play a little video. It's an interview of the former general of Wesley Clark, who talked about what the idea of American foreign policy has been since after 9/11. And you would see that playbook that they have been using, Let's listen to this interview of Wesley Clark.
After 9/11, I went through the Pentagon and I saw Secretary Rumsfeld and Deputy Secretary Wolfowitz. I went downstairs just to say hello to some of the people on the Joint Staff who used to work for me. And one of the generals called me and he said, "Sir, you got to come in. You got to come in and talk to me a second." I said, "Well, you're too busy." He said, No. He says, "We've made the decision. We're going to war with Iraq." This was on or about the 20th of September. I said, "We're going to war with Iraq. Why?" He said, "I don't know." He said, "I guess they don't know what else to do." So I said, "Well, did they find some information connecting Saddam to Al-Qaeda?" He said, No. He says, "There's nothing new that way. They just made the decision to go to war with Iraq." He said, "I guess it's like we don't know what to do about terrorists, but we've got a good military and we can take down governments." And he said, "I guess if the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem has to look like a nail." So I came back to see him a few weeks later, and by that time we were bombing in Afghanistan. I said, "Are we still going to war with Iraq?" And he said, "Oh, it's worse than that." He said, he reached over on his desk, he picked up a piece of paper, he said, I just got this down from upstairs," meaning the Secretary of Defense's office today, and he said, "This is a memo that describes how we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years. Starting with Iraq and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran." I said, "Is it classified?" He said, "Yes, sir." I said, "Well, don't show it to me." And I saw him a year or so ago, and I said, "You remember that?" He said, "Sir, I didn't show you that memo. I didn't show it to you."
So that is General Wesley Clark, or basically talking about a memo, from a classified memo from the United States that basically set out a roadmap of what the U.S. was going to achieve in 5 years. And you look, and that is a little scary, because if you look at all of those countries that he listed, 7 countries. So we're starting with Iraq, then Syria, then Lebanon, then Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finish with Iran. I mean, it did not take them 5 years to accomplish that. But you look at the list of those countries, they did overthrow the government of Iraq shortly after 9/11. And then, they did end up overthrowing Muammar Gaddafi in Libya in 2011. It took them a little more than 5 years to get there, but they overthrew Muammar Gaddafi in Libya in 2011. And then, they've eventually overthrown the government of Lebanon, and they've overthrown the government of Syria. Bashar has been overthrown. In the same thing has happened in Somalia, Sudan. Bashar in Sudan has been overthrown. And then finishing with Iran. Iran was the one country standing. Iran was the one country standing that they were not able to achieve this. They were not able to overthrow the government of Iran. And this is following the fact that they had in the past already organized a coup and overthrown a then democratically elected president of Iran back in the 1950s, and put somebody that favors the United States in power, that led to riots in Iran all the way into the 1970s, where the Iranian Revolution eventually happened and he was overthrown. And so now, you have already done this in this country. So the United States has this policy of creating coups, forming coups, overthrowing governments, creating hostile situations that then promotes its foreign interest. It's been doing this for a long time. It has the same playbook that it's been using for a long time, and it continues to use for a long time. And this is the same playbook that Benjamin Netanyahu has been pushing the United States to use in Iran. And he pushed and pushed and pushed since 2005 all the way into 2025, when he eventually just decided to single-handedly bomb Iran. Even though you can argue that there is no way Netanyahu made this decision by himself, because even though publicly the United States said it was not interested in a war with Iran, I'm sure that the United States did give a go-ahead for Netanyahu to bomb Iran. That then led to the 12 days of hostilities in Iran that eventually, between Iran and Israel, and then the United States, that eventually culminated with the so-called ending of the war between Israel and Iran. So, again, to kind of end this episode today, my heart is heavy, because I think that we are continuing a never-ending Cold War that started with the death of Franklin Roosevelt and the formation of the U.S. military-industrial complex it's propagated since the 1940s, and it's purported to have ended in 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Union, but I argue that the Cold War continues to go on because this battle of ideologies continues to go on, and people continue to die because of it. And it's continued, and it's what is going on now between Russia and the European Union, with the United States as their backer. My heart is heavy, because as this continues to go on, people are being sacrificed. And if you've ever read the book, When Elephants Fight, It Is the Grass That Suffers. It illustrates the fact of two powerful nations fighting, and kids have been abducted in Ukraine. Kids are being forced in Ukraine to go to the front lines and join the army, where they are surely going to be killed. And they're the grass that suffer from the fight that is going on between these major powers. And as this continues to happen, a new world order takes effect. And because this podcast is a Pan-Africanism podcast, and the fate of Africa is what my fundamental interests are, it paints a picture. It paints a picture of Africa, and maybe new allies have to be found. And this dependence on Europe, and this dependence on the United States, it's proving time and again to be of no benefit to African countries. So maybe it is time as African countries to stand up as we are standing up to fight for ourselves. And as we are standing up to fight for a united Africa, we need to look at potentially new allies, or we need to look at neutrality, because this idea of if you are not with the West, then you are against the West, that is preposterous, and that is something that has been pushed on weaker and poorer countries for as long as the Cold War has gone on. And maybe taking the sidelines and just watching and saying, I am not going to be blindly supporting the West on this crusade that it has launched against Russia, even though Russia seems to show no interest in expanding its borders and conquering new territory. So this push on why is the African Union not saying anything, and why is the African Union not siding with the West? Well, this is your answer. The African Union does not want to side with the West because we are not going to be blind anymore, and we are not going to blindly support the propaganda machine that the West has set and tries to convince everybody else to fight to try to defend that propaganda. So let me know what you think about this. Let me know what you think Africa should like the position that Africa should take in the midst of this devastating disaster that is going on the world stage right now. Thank you again for joining me for this episode of our Africa First Pan-Africanism Podcast, the issues that are happening around the world. And I would see you next time.